9. Beyond competition. Thoughts on making change. The prevailing mode of competition in American culture thus continues despite convincing evidence that it is damaging to physical, spiritual, emotional, and social health. And what is the reaction of members of the helping professions? Are we creative agents of social change, or are we dispensers of band-aids to the injured and facilitators of adjustment to the way things are? Vera J. Elson. Competition, a cultural imperative. Intentional and structural competition revisited. The cartoon animals children watch on Saturday morning TV continue to run even when there is no longer any ground under their feet, at least until they look down. It is as if some combination of ignorance and momentum allows them to keep going. The same may be said of competition. We persist in our furious efforts to be number one. We continue to believe this is somehow in our best interests, and we raise yet another generation to do the same. We do these things despite the fact that cooperative, as compared to competitive, systems of distributing rewards, when they differ, have more favorable effects on individual and group productivity, individual learning, social relations, self-esteem, task attitudes, and a sense of responsibility to other group members. This conclusion is consistent with the research results obtained by many other investigators in hundreds of studies. It is by now a well-established finding, even though it is counter to widely held ideologies about the relative benefits of competition. Despite this evidence, reviewed here by Morton Deutsch, we continue trying to succeed at the price of other people's failure. Often we are those, other people, who fail, but this scarcely diminishes our quest for victory or our belief that competition is good for us. Changing this state of affairs is difficult because structural and intentional competition reinforce each other. How can we eliminate the competitive framework of our society so long as there still exists both a widespread belief that competition is desirable and a strong inclination to beat other people? On the other hand, how can we change these views so long as a structure remains in place that requires us to compete and inclines us to bring our beliefs into line with our actions? It is the same dilemma confronted a generation ago by civil rights activists. Trying to end segregation by governmental fiat would run into resistance because of widespread racist attitudes. Yet how could racism ever be overcome in a segregated society? Neither the individual's values nor those of the system are primary. Paul Wachtel has written, each determines the other in continuous reciprocal interaction. People in a system with competitive values tend to become competitive, and in so doing they keep the system competitively oriented. How can we break this vicious circle? By tackling both levels at once. What works best is a multiple approach, confining itself neither solely to changing overt behavior nor to promoting insight alone, but rather attempting to weaken a number of links in the causal chains simultaneously. Since our beliefs and values shape our institutions, and our institutions shape our beliefs and values, a multifaceted effort is required. Alas, Wachtel does not offer much in the way of guidance as to how to undertake this multifaceted effort. That will be the task of this chapter. I argued in Chapter 5 that intentional competition could be understood in terms of self-esteem needs. We try to beat others in an effort to prove our own worth. Ultimately, this strategy reveals itself as futile, since making our self-esteem contingent on winning means that it will always be in doubt. The more we compete, the more we need to compete. Escaping this trap ultimately means finding more successful ways of securing our self-esteem, building an unconditional sense of trust in ourselves that will make it unnecessary to keep demonstrating our superiority. The better I feel about myself, the less I will need to make you lose. Carl Rogers emphasized that the experience of being accepted by others permits us to accept ourselves. Intuitively, this seems more promising than trying to triumph over others. Given the unique dimensions of these issues for each person, however, I would not presume to offer a recipe for setting this complex process into motion. All I can reasonably do here is to call attention to the connection between intentional competition and self-esteem. Overcoming the former means in some respect concerning oneself with the latter. Self-esteem is not an all-or-nothing affair, of course. Those who are least secure about themselves may require the most confirmation of their talents, and ultimately, of their goodness. But all of us want to check how we are doing and reassure ourselves that we are competent. We are accustomed to doing so by ranking ourselves, to the point that where we stand, in relation to others, defines who we are. Because of this, a critic should have something with which to replace comparison if he is going to urge us to move beyond it. If we have come to be dependent on ranking for our very identities, we cannot very well expect to adjust instantly to its absence. Happily, as I pointed out in an earlier chapter, comparing oneself to others is not the only way to measure our progress. We can look instead to our own past performance, or to some absolute standard to see how well we are doing. Content with swimming a few more laps than I did last week, I will not feel compelled to find out how many laps the person in the next lane has completed. If we are obliged to participate in structural competition, we can still work to reduce personal competitiveness. At the very least, we can shift to what I have called process competition, by directing attention away from the results of an activity. If we are playing a competitive game, we ought not to keep score. If it will be obvious who wins, we should at least avoid awarding any prizes or making a fuss over the victor. By minimizing the significance of winning, we simultaneously soften the blow of losing. Whenever we take part in a contest, we can try to nest it in fellowship. By making a special effort to fortify the bonds between competitors, the destructive effects of having to work against each other can be eased a bit. Friendly gestures to rivals will be reciprocated more often than one might imagine. Our opponents probably feel as isolated and trapped by the structure as we do. At the very least, such pleasantness can moderate the hostility that is generated by competing for the same position or prize. Trying to be number one in all situations may be rooted in self-esteem needs, but it can be driven by force of habit as well. We simply become accustomed to thinking along these lines. It may be fruitful to monitor one's own competitiveness as it makes itself felt in various situations, and then make a conscious effort to tame this impulse. Why did I just interrupt him again? I'm trying to prove to everyone that I'm cleverer than he is. What if I just sat back and listened to what he had to say? Why am I resolving to go on a diet again, just because a woman who's thinner than I walked into the room? There are always going to be women thinner than I. Big deal. A directed awareness of our own competitiveness can help us to confront and transcend the reflexive urge to outdo everyone else. All of these considerations are particularly relevant to raising or teaching children. A child's performance should never be compared with that of someone else, including a sibling, a classmate, or oneself as a child, in order to motivate her to do better. Affection and approval should not be made contingent on a child's performance. This means more than offering transparent consolations to a child who has lost. Oh well, as long as you did your best, honey. It means being genuinely unconcerned with the results of competitive encounters in which she is involved, including victories. We should be particularly alert to the subtle and insidious ways in which we encourage our children to tie their feelings of self-worth to winning. So long as we need them to be the best in their class, they will get the message and require the same of themselves. The result, as we have seen, is not excellence but anxiety, self-doubt, hostility, and a decline in intrinsic motivation, among other things. The psychological and interpersonal damage wrought by competition is so severe that we should also let children know of it in explicit terms. There are school programs to tell children about the abuse of drugs, including tobacco and alcohol. Why not do the same with regard to mutually exclusive goal attainment? Surely the evidence is clear enough, and the stakes high enough. Granted that what we do is more important than what we say, above all, we should not set children against one another, and we should not act in such a way as to present them with competitive role models. But it also may be helpful to teach them, adjusting the lesson to their level of development, of course, about the myths of competition and the respects in which cooperation offers a healthier alternative. After all, we currently train children to compete, as Chapter 2 describes, so we would not be moving from value-free education to indoctrination, but from a lesson in favor of competition to one against it. Let us show our children both how and why to cooperate. All of this concerns intentional competition, the inclination to be better than others, which is a matter of values and self-esteem. There is every reason to attend to both in an effort to become less competitive. Still, the effectiveness of such efforts is circumscribed by the structure of our economic system, our schooling, and our leisure activities. If these are set up so as to condition one person's success on another's failure, then a healthy non-competitive attitude will seem peculiar and downright maladaptive. It will, in any event, be difficult to sustain. When I began to think about competition, I saw structural and intentional competition as reciprocally related in a fashion so perfectly balanced that they caused each other to the same degree. Over time I have come to revise this position, finally realizing that the structural level is far more significant. It is possible to minimize the importance of winning and losing, but to do so requires one to swim against the current, to ignore what is demanded by the structure of the activity. It is possible to remain on friendly terms with competitors, but the fact that their interests are inversely related to one's own predisposes each side to view the other with hostility. It is possible to be a good sport, but even this runs counter to the competitive imperative. Let us consider a concrete illustration of how a structure can elicit particular behaviors. Philip Zimbardo and his colleagues at Stanford University conducted a novel experiment on the effects of imprisonment by choosing 21 male college students to take on the roles of guards and inmates in a very realistic prison created in the basement of the psychology building. The 21 subjects were selected from a group of 75 volunteers precisely on the basis of their normality. They were stable and scored in the middle range of a personality profile. Equally important, they were randomly assigned to the role of prisoner or guard. Almost immediately, the subjects began to take on the pathological characteristics of their respective roles. The guards delighted in devising arbitrary tasks and absurd rules for the inmates, demanding absolute obedience and forcing them to humiliate each other. The prisoners became passive and obedient, taking their frustration out on each other and otherwise assuming the role of victim. As the guards became more abusive, the prisoners became more helpless and dependent. The patterns became so pronounced that Zimbardo grew alarmed and ended what was to have been a 2-week experiment after only 6 days. Given the design of this experiment, what happened cannot be explained in terms of the individuals involved. The researchers, like the subjects, had been inclined to focus on personality traits as internal dispositions for individuals to respond in particular ways, thus underestimating the subtle power of situational forces to control and reshape their behavior. Most of us make the same error, Zimbardo contends, leading us to try to solve problems by changing the people, by motivating them, isolating them, and so on. In fact, he concludes, to change behavior we must discover the institutional supports which maintain the existing undesirable behavior, and then design programs to alter these environments. This is nowhere more true than in the case of competition. We are constantly reinforced for wanting to be number one because this orientation is appropriate to the win/lose structure in which we keep finding ourselves. It is the fact of having to participate in contests that leads us to try to outdo others. And it is the fact of having to participate in contests that we are going to have to change if we want to move in healthier directions. Nearly 70 years ago, John Harvey and his colleagues distinguished between deliberate and involuntary competition, which are roughly comparable to what I have been calling intentional and structural, respectively. In the whole moral environment provided by our civilization, involuntary competition easily becomes deliberate, Harvey concluded. Among the personality traits that involuntary competition elicits, he says, is selfishness. We would not set out to generate this quality deliberately, but we cannot escape from doing so incidentally and inadvertently so long as our commercial practice pits one against another, as now it does. William Sadler similarly insists that the structure determines how individuals look at the world. The value orientation which holds competition high is perpetuated as individuals participate in institutions which help to shape their perception of reality. There is, in other words, a convergence of social forces which fosters a common perception of the world so that it is viewed in competitive terms. Added to this institutional factor is the dissipation of forces that would inhibit competition. The evidence offered in chapters 5 and 6 substantiates this view. Our psychological state and our relationships with others not only are correlated with the extent of our intentional competitiveness, but are changed by a framework of structural competition. Deutsch, to cite yet another study, found that the psychological orientations of the subjects, including their views of themselves and of the others in their group, were considerably different as a function of the distributive system under which they worked. Another sort of evidence is provided by Susan Shirk's account of how Chinese students, who were cooperatively inclined, began to stop helping each other when a competitive structure was imposed on them. Closer to home, one need only watch what happens to courteous and cooperative drivers when they move to a city where an informal but powerful structure demands competitive behavior on the roads. In remarkably short order, individual personality patterns shift to accommodate the structure. The primacy of structural forces also can be demonstrated by showing that a cooperative framework changes behaviors and attitudes. After reviewing several strategies for lowering intentional competition, Terry Orlick wrote, "It may be more fruitful to introduce new games than to change old orientations. We may come closer to achieving our objectives if we simply let cooperative games do the shaping." When values follow from the structure, moreover, they are generalized throughout an individual's life, as Paul Breer and Edwin Locke found, to the extent that a man is rewarded for putting the organization's goals first, harmonizing his own efforts with those of his colleagues, and making himself personally attractive to the people around him, he will develop situationally specific orientations in which cooperation, harmony, teamwork, etc. are seen as instrumental to success, intrinsically pleasurable, and morally desirable. From his job, such orientations can be expected to spill over to his family, community, and even society as a whole. This, it will be recalled, is precisely the sort of thing we found in the laboratory. A final example of the effects of structural cooperation is provided by Robert Axelrod. In the course of discussing the prisoner's dilemma game, in which a cooperative strategy proves most effective, Axelrod cites a fascinating historical illustration. During World War I, army battalions that faced each other from their respective trenches often agreed not to shoot, a kind of live and let live understanding that emerged spontaneously. This mutual restraint was, of course, infuriating to the high commands of both sides, but soldiers had the temerity to persist in not killing each other. Obviously, they had not been predisposed to work together, having been trained to hate each other. Structural cooperation took root in spite of their attitudes. In fact, the new arrangement changed these attitudes. Axelrod cites an incident in which a shot was fired inadvertently one day, prompting a German to call out, "We are very sorry about that. We hope no one was hurt." This apparently genuine concern, Axelrod comments, goes well beyond a merely instrumental effort to prevent retaliation. The cooperative exchanges of mutual restraint actually changed the nature of the interaction. They tended to make the two sides care about each other's welfare. Individual orientations, in other words, were affected by the structure. How to prevent social change? Making our society less competitive ultimately depends on reducing structural competition. Unfortunately, bringing about structural change of any kind requires overcoming enormous resistance. It is much easier to describe how change can be blocked than how it can be furthered. For those so inclined, then, here are 5 simple ways to perpetuate the status quo. 1. Limit your vision. The long-standing American tradition of ignoring the structural causes of social and individual problems was mentioned in Chapter 7. By pretending, for example, that psychological disturbance has nothing to do with the societal forces that shape personality development, you can help see to it that those forces continue unabated. It follows that all intervention should be done at the individual level. It is fine to help, say, homeless people on a case-by-case basis, but inquiring into the policy decisions and economic arrangements that have brought about their predicament would only serve to invite drastic changes. And this is what we want to avoid at all costs. Similarly, if we continue to treat each example of corporate wrongdoing, from illegal dumping of toxic wastes to bribing of public officials, as if it has occurred in a vacuum, then we can manage to preserve the system responsible for these acts. 2. Adapt. The best way to keep the status quo intact is to make sure that individuals adjust themselves to serve its needs. Such adaptation once was enforced by crude, authoritarian methods of re-education. Today this is hardly necessary. A wealth of advice is available on how to become successful, what to wear, how to negotiate, and so forth, and virtually all of it proceeds from the premise that you should adjust yourself to conditions as you find them. Adaptation is a critical part of the self-help model. You must succeed within the institutions and according to the rules that already exist. To do well is to fit in, and to fit in is to fortify the structures into which you are being fit. 3. Think about yourself, implicit in any exhortations to succeed by giving them what they want, is the suggestion that you should be totally preoccupied with your own well-being. The more you limit your concerns to yourself, the more you help to sustain the larger system. But this does not apply merely to material success. Even therapeutic and spiritual enterprises are useful for preserving the status quo because in encouraging you to attend to your own needs, they effectively direct attention away from social structures. Groom yourself and let the rest of the world go on its way. What better strategy is there for perpetuating existing structures? A few people may argue, it is true, that personal growth can be a route to social change. But most of the human potential movement will not require you to wrestle with this question, since social change is irrelevant to its goals and techniques. 4. Be realistic. Fortunately, it is not necessary for you to defend the larger system. You can even nod in sympathetic agreement with someone who indicts it. But it is crucial that this nodding be accompanied by a shrug. Phrases such as, like it or not, and that's just the way it is, should be employed liberally in order to emphasize that nothing can be done about the larger picture. Such protestations of powerlessness are actually very powerful, of course, since they make sure that things are left exactly as they are. Every person who is encouraged to take such a stance is another person rescued from social activism. Occasionally a critic will refuse to resign himself to the way things are or to believe that we are helpless to make change. Such an individual should immediately be labeled idealistic. Do not be concerned about the vaguely complimentary connotations of having ideals. It will be understood that an idealist is someone who does not understand the world as it is. World equals our society. As it is equals as it will always be. This label efficiently calls attention to the critic's faulty understanding of reality or human nature, and ensures that he is not taken seriously. Those who are pragmatic, by contrast, know that we must always work within the confines of what we are given. After all, if alternative models really were workable, we would already be using them. Appeals to realism have the virtue of allowing you to avoid messy discussions about the value of a critic's position, and thus of the status quo. Why bother with such issues when you can dismiss his vision as well-meaning but unworkable? Challenging the rightness of what he is proposing will only slow him down. It is the appeal to practicality that produces the knockout. Call someone wrong-headed or even evil and a lengthy discussion may follow. Call him utopian or naive and there is nothing more to be said. This method of dismissing models of change is uniquely effective since it sets up a self-fulfilling prophecy. If enough people insist that an alternative arrangement cannot work, they will be right. Its failure then can be cited as substantiation of one's original skepticism. No one uses this maneuver more skillfully than policymakers who are mistrustful of public institutions. Because of their conviction that governments can do nothing right, they divert funds from public schools and hospitals. When the inevitable crisis develops, they say, "You see?" Appeals to realism can ensure that institutions which threaten to promote social change, e.g., legislative bodies, universities, the media, do nothing but reflect the status quo. In the name of democracy, descriptive accuracy, and objective journalism, respectively, these institutions can be tamed and made into powerful instruments for perpetuating whatever is in place. Here, to take a tiny example, is New York Times education writer Fred Heckinger, regrettably, the importance of the message has also invaded children's television. One episode of The Flintstones, a favorite children's cartoon, had a hotly contested baseball game end in a tie, followed by celebrations of brotherly and sisterly love, hardly the real aim in any normal child's view of competitive games. This exemplary criticism should be studied carefully. Heckinger is demonstrating how to dismiss as inappropriate any scenario that does not conform to the existing values and structures of our society. To challenge our current practices is idealistic and, worse, contains a message. To reinforce our current practices is realistic and contains no message. Most children's programs do not offend Heckinger because they display, and thereby shape, normal people, i.e., those who are intent on winning at any cost. 5. Rationalize. It is easier for critics to oppose existing institutions when those who defend and profit from them are obviously opposed to social change. You can make it more difficult for these critics, and salve your own conscience at the same time, by claiming that your real reason for acting as you do is to change the system from within. Like most people who talk this way, of course, you do not actually have to make change. On the contrary, even if this really were your goal, you would be permitted to work only for insignificant reforms that never come close to challenging the structures themselves. By becoming part of these structures, you can proceed to seek personal aggrandizement, while at the same time contributing your talents to something you profess to find problematic. A variation of this maneuver is to claim that you are going to do so for only a short time, as if it were a simple matter to leave the fast lane and get over to the exit ramp. If you are audacious enough, you can even rationalize your participation as the most effective way to change the system. The more people who accept this reasoning and follow your example, the more secure is that system toward a non-competitive society. Whether employed deliberately or not, these mechanisms for frustrating change have been devastatingly effective. My point in reviewing them is to make it easier to anticipate and deal with such maneuvers. Having considered some of the issues that arise with respect to generic change, we can return to the specific case of competition. If competition is indeed unhelpful and destructive, and if attitudes and personal goals are shaped by the win-slash-lose structure, then we need to set about the formidable task of undoing the arrangements that set us against one another, from parlor games to geopolitical conflict. While working to dismantle existing structures, we should also be careful not to produce new occasions for competition. This means taking pains to avoid creating scarcity. Most scarcity is artificial, I have argued, because a prize status has been set up where none existed before. As parents and teachers and managers, we are constantly transforming situations into contests. In fact, the widespread assumption that someone's got to lose arises only because we keep making goal attainment mutually exclusive. Every time we make salespeople try to outdo one another, every time we display the best homework assignment in class on the bulletin board, every time we call out to our children, "Who can set the table fastest?" we are contributing to the unnecessary and undesirable competitiveness that suffuses our culture. The real alternative to being number one, as I have already noted, is not being number two, it is dispensing with rankings altogether. Starting immediately, we can stop contriving contests, and we can urge our friends and colleagues and children's teachers to do likewise. At the very least, we can present the case against competition to them so they understand the implications of what they are doing. All of this applies to the vast number of cases where scarcity is created. But even where scarcity seems to be real, we need to look at the bigger picture to determine whether certain assumptions or policy decisions, which can be re-evaluated, lie behind competition and give it the appearance of necessity. Consider a familiar example. When cars prowl the city streets in search of parking spaces, the shortage is not invented and the quest is clearly competitive. But the number of spaces to be had downtown was not decreed by God. It is the result of a decision that can be changed. The same is true for the availability and convenience of mass transit, which indirectly causes or eliminates the frustrating race for space. Instead of taking competition for granted, We ought to be asking what broader arrangements might be altered so as to present us with a structure that does not require winners and losers. Sometimes the search for these broader arrangements will lead us to the very foundations of our economic and political system. This does not mean we ought to drop the matter and resign ourselves to competition. On the contrary, whatever we encounter, however large the stakes, is open to question and, perhaps, transformation. There are quite a few thinkers whose work is useful in beginning to think about reducing structural competition. Terry Orlick offers non-competitive games as a way of reconceptualizing recreation. Why not create and play games that make us more cooperative, honest, and considerate of others? He asks. David and Roger Johnson propose non-competitive alternatives in the classroom as a way of improving education. Robert Paul Wolfe sketches a plan for severing the ties between high school performance and college admissions, and again between college performance and graduate admissions. Both moves would allow genuine learning to replace the awful competitive scramble that now preoccupies students. On the political scene, Benjamin Barber has argued persuasively that the adversarial and individualistic underpinnings of politics as we know it are actually inimical to democracy. In their place, he proposes a consensus-based system that is similar to the cooperative resolution of conflict discussed in Chapter 6. With respect to global rivalry, Morton Deutsch, among others, emphasizes that the old notion of national security must be replaced by the new notion of mutual security. In each case, the revolt against competition is wedded to the affirmation of an alternative vision. This is a practical necessity, since we can hardly tear down one set of structures without offering something in its place. But the alternative also is the very reason for objecting to competition in the first place. It is because we value human relationship, among other things, that we found competing to be problematic. The motive for opposing competition and the arrangement to replace it are one and the same: cooperation. Despite the productivity and sense of fulfillment that come from working together, we often act as if cooperation is something for which we must sit passively and wait, like a beautiful sunset. In fact, there is scarcely an arena of human life which cannot be transformed into a cooperative enterprise. I have hinted throughout this book at how this might be done, from leisure activities to workplace cooperatives, but I have not laid out anything like a comprehensive guide for coordinating our efforts. Having concentrated my efforts on a critique of competition, I leave that task to others, confident that there will be no shortage of suggestions once our energies are freed from planning and participating in competitive projects. Once the myths justifying competition are behind us, the prospects are good for changing the structures that perpetuate it. So long as we remain a competitive society, however, it will be possible to insist that one has got to compete to survive. This argument is heard most often from those who actually have no inclination to stop competing, and often from those who, as Bertrand Russell pointed out, are really invoking survival in order to justify their desire to beat others. But let us assume that this objection is offered not as a rationalization but as an expression of genuine discomfort, arising from the inability to reconcile one's own values with the competitive demands of our culture. What can we say in response? There are no easy answers here. We should begin by reviewing the catalogue of competition's disadvantages. It may seem prudent to enter contests and devote ourselves to winning, but the many respects in which competition is destructive should be weighed against the need to join the race. To follow out the price we pay for this way of life into all the intricacies of social and personal life, the frustration and wastage of temperaments and abilities that do not and cannot conform to this competitive stereotype, the inevitable failure of the many who try to conform and fail, more often from lack of aggressiveness rather than absence of ability. These are some of the inquiries that we should and probably will make as time goes on. Furthermore, the apparent necessity of competing is another of the self-fulfilling prophecies that we keep encountering. As each of us sighs and says he has no choice but to stay ahead of the next person, that next person feels compelled to do the same. You become part of the they to which someone else refers. To take this perspective is to move beyond our customary individualistic frame of reference. Even if it seems appropriate for me to compete, overlooking for the moment the price I pay for doing so, I need to ask whether it is in our collective interest to keep competing. That such a discrepancy can exist is, of course, the lesson of the prisoner's dilemma game described earlier. If it is not, then we need not only to think but to act as a group. Replacing structural competition with cooperation requires collective action, and collective action requires education and organization. An individual tenant is at the mercy of her landlord, but if all the tenants in the building unite, they can demand their rights. The same is true of competition. An individual may in some respects lose out by refusing to take part in a mutually destructive struggle, but a group of people who work in an office or study at a college or send their children to a school can join forces. By helping others to see the terrible consequences of a system that predicates one person's success on another's failure, we can act together to change that system. As with other features of the status quo, the stakes are highest here for those with the least power. People who have systematically been denied the opportunity to earn a decent wage, to lead a life with dignity, to make decisions about what affects them, may think it peculiar to be told that competition is destructive. After all, they might argue, my only hope is to enter the race and try to win, to beat them at their own game. It is not a coincidence that this is precisely the response to oppression encouraged by those who hold the power. First, this strategy rarely works, even in conventional terms, because the deck is stacked. Those who already are winners are in better shape to win succeeding contests. Edgar Z. Friedenberg put it this way: the classic device for legitimating the unequal distribution of rewards in a democratic society is, of course, competition in which the same rules are applied to all the contestants, and the status system of the society is protected by the nature of the rules rather than by their inequitable application. The people in the society thus learn to divide themselves into winners and losers and to blame themselves for being among the losers if they are. Second, to participate in competition is to help perpetuate an arrangement that caused the problem in the first place. No one stands to benefit more from a non-competitive society than those who have been cheated by a competitive society. Transforming the nature of society, then, requires a collective effort and a long-term commitment. In the meantime, each of us has a series of choices to make. Once it becomes clear why competition ought to be avoided, we must re-examine our own lives to determine what concessions to the prevailing ethic, if any, we are prepared to make. These concessions should be made with a clear understanding of the costs, both personal and societal, that they entail. And they should strengthen our resolve to work at the same time to create healthy, productive, cooperative alternatives.